Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Ashley Adams, who is by profession a union organizer and negotiator representing broadcasters, healthcare workers, and for the past 10 years, the Massachusetts Teachers Association. Ashley is married to an Alexander Technique teacher, Debbie Adams, and Ashley has some experience with the Alexander Technique, and we're going to talk today about how the Alexander Technique might be useful for people who are negotiators. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert.
I wonder if you'd be willing to give our listeners a short description of the Alexander Technique from your point of view.
Sure, happy to. I always describe the Alexander Technique to people who ask me what my wife does as a method of unlearning bad habits of movement and posture and relearning a more easeful way of doing whatever it is that you do. And then if they continue to show interest, I might add that what an Alexander teacher does is show people how to interrupt their bad habits and insert instead a more thoughtful way of doing whatever they do. So that's how I describe it.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that in negotiations, at least as I've seen them portrayed in movies and on TV, there could be quite an advantage in being able to act in non-habitual ways. Would that be your experience?
Yeah, actually, what's interesting to me, Robert, is that there are, generally speaking, two approaches to bargaining. And I'm speaking very broadly when I say two approaches. There are thousands of approaches. We each have our own approach, but you could put them into two very broad categories. One is the traditional method of bargaining, which is known as positional bargaining. And that's what you've seen in the movies or on television, where typically the union comes to the table with its demands and the company comes maybe with its demands, and you make your case and argue and pound your fist and they say no, and then you haggle over things and maybe you compromise on a couple and you do some horse trading, and finally maybe under the threat of a strike or a walkout or something you end up with an agreement. And then there's a more modern, not necessarily better, but a more modern method of bargaining, especially in the public and nonprofit sectors, called interest-based bargaining. And interest-based bargaining, to me, has at least a large component of the Alexander Technique in it, because what you're trying to do is not just tell the other side what it is you want. And you're not just responding habitually, as it were, to the other side's proposal. What you're trying to do is to get inside the what that's being said at the table, interrupt your habitual no, and think about the why that something is being proposed. So, for example, I represent teachers, and we might traditionally, in positional bargaining, we come to the table with a 4% raise, and we want 2 personal days, and we want 5 more sick days, and we want improvements in the health insurance, blah, blah, blah. A laundry list of proposals. That's habitually our historic way of getting improvements, is by coming to the table with as long a list as we can muster and try to wear the other side down. And their habitual way of responding is to say no to everything, and then maybe they wear us down, and when they offer us 1 or 2 things in a much, much smaller raise than we've demanded, we're so eager to have some agreement that we say yes, and we end up settling for that. And instead, interest-based bargaining, which is not always better, it's sometimes just a good option to consider, you would start by having each side talk about their general interests, the things they would like to see addressed without a specific proposal. For example, you might say, well, we find that a lot of the employees have doctor appointments that they can't schedule after work because the doctors are not available after work. And so it would be helpful to be able to have them schedule doctor's appointments during the school day on occasion. And the employer could say, well, our concern is we don't want to have to hire substitutes because they're expensive and they can't maintain the continuity of education. So that's their interest in that subject. And then you would work on, by listening to the other side, instead of habitually responding no and negatively and pounding your fist, you would insert a more thoughtful approach to understanding the problem and coming up with options that maybe the other side can think of an option to address your interests. So, for example, instead of demanding 3 personal days, if you're able to interrupt the bargaining process, the historic bargaining process, the habitual bargaining process, and let the other side say, well, why do you want the personal days? And then you could say, well, we need time to go to the doctor. Then maybe they would say, well, here's an option. What about if instead of giving you more personal days, we created a flexible schedule that would allow you to come in early a couple of times a year and leave early? Or maybe you could have a couple of days that you could leave and take a quarter a day instead of a whole day. You wouldn't need more days. Maybe you just need more flexibility on our part to be able to use what you have. And so the Alexander technique, by training people to think in ways that are outside the box, so to speak, not just habitually, not just the way you've always thought about things, can help a negotiator find creative solutions by giving them a willingness to inhibit their habitual no or yes and be more creative in the process of thinking of options at the table. So that's a very big answer to a very simple question. But that's how I think the Alexander technique may help a negotiator theoretically. Now you got another issue, which is bargainers. We sit at the table, we get very tense, very stressed out, and our posture and our movement tend to regress to the most basic kind of hunched over tense posture that you can imagine. So having Alexander work might help us. I've never actually considered this before you brought it up, but we may be helping ourselves physically by learning to inhibit that habitual response to the stress and the tension of bargaining and replace it with a more easeful way, a more relaxed way of sitting and shuffling through our papers, etc., even when the pressure of bargaining becomes pretty severe.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify that word inhibit, that's a bit of an Alexander technique jargon phrase. Really means just stop what you don't want. But
Right.
Most people would identify that with Freud's concept of inhibition, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
No, although I have said screw you at the bargaining table, I did not mean it in a Freudian sense.
Right. Uh, well, so is basically your point that Alexander lessons, or say the concepts of the Alexander technique, tend in general to give you more possibilities, certainly in movement, more possibilities. Alexander technique is generally associated with things like posture and movement, and that exposure to, wow, there are other ways I can do things that never occurred to me before, in sitting or standing or moving, that would carry over into how I might approach a negotiation process with somebody.
Well, right. In fact, quite literally, it's just funny. This just occurred to me. When the other side is behaving in a way that you think is, they're just doing their typical anti-proposal dance. They're just acting like bosses, or they think of us, you're just acting like the union. The verb you use when you are accusing somebody of just doing what you always do is you say, come on, you're just posturing.
Yes.
which,
Uh-huh.
interestingly enough, is exactly what we're talking about. You don't want to posture in sophisticated bargaining. You want to be thoughtful and reflective and creative and helpful in reaching a solution, as opposed to just aping the posture you've always had, which is to be antagonistic toward the other side and a champion of all that is right, which is your side. So the Alexander technique maybe can help bargainers learn to posture less and be more easeful and literally flexible in their approach.
And just to return briefly to your point about negotiators having to sit for long hours, uh, I can certainly remember a number of times hearing news reports of negotiating teams basically being locked up for 24 or 48 hours and sort of forced, in a sense, to come to some agreement. And just thinking about the physical aspects of that, being forced to sit at a table for many, many hours, the 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 demands on your physical mechanism doing something like that and especially coupled with the stress of the negotiation would certainly take its toll on a physical level without some ability on your part um, to reorganize your body in a better way.
Oh, of course, that's absolutely the case. Although, ironically, Robert, and I've had my share of all-night bargaining sessions. Sometimes it is the very physical discomfort and pain of your bargaining session that prompts you to be more willing to accept a compromise than you might be. So, ironically, again, and I'm being a little bit humorous here, um, both sides are well versed in the Alexander technique, and you go to your bargaining table with an Alexander technique for all of the members of your team, it might allow you to withstand the tension and the stiffness that you might normally feel and wait out the other side and not come to an agreement because, frankly, you're feeling fine and refreshed after 20 hours of sitting at the bargaining table, and you'll be damned if you're going to give in, as opposed to being cramped and miserable and physically exhausted because you don't know anything about the Alexander technique. And well, God, it's been 20 hours. I'll settle for a 2% raise instead of the 4% because I just want to get out of this hellhole. Uh,
Right.
Ironically, it might work to your disadvantage. So
Well, so
you understand
yes,
what I'm
but
saying?
on the other hand, if your side has the benefit of these Alexander insights and the other side doesn't,
That's right. It works
that's
to
the
your
kind of
advantage.
that's the edge you'd
You
like,
can wait
right?
them out. They
Right.
think you're suffering, and meanwhile, your head is released and you're floating and you're being creative and you're feeling really good after 20 hours. While the other side is just thinking, oh, I got to get out of here. All right, we'll give in. You get your extra sick days. Get the hell out of here. I'm miserable. That's
Right.
very good. That's true.
So I wonder if it makes any sense to expand what we've been talking about to include negotiation in a more general way. I mean, I know one could argue that almost any interaction of two or more people involves some kind of negotiation.
That's right.
And how do you see the Alexander technique and Alexander technique principles coming to play there?
Well, it gets back to the old adage, and I may be misquoting and I'm paraphrasing, that if you can keep your head while the other side is losing theirs, you have an advantage. And
Hmm.
that's true in every situation you can think of. And having your head, while keeping your head, you can think literally of keeping your head fluid and mobile and released and open and all of that, while the other side is tight and constrained and restricted and habitual and all of that. Well, it helps you in life, right? When you're
Hmm.
going to buy a car or a house or getting a contract or buying food or whatever you do in life with anybody else, how much better for you if you're able to do it easily and healthfully as when the other side perhaps isn't.
And maybe in many situations, while they might technically be a form of negotiation, they're not the sort of oppositional things that you would get, say, with a union and a company, but maybe someone and their spouse negotiating over something that some activity they're planning to do or some decision
Right.
they're going to make. And so in a case like that, if you are applying Alexander principles, maybe some of that will rub off on the other person and they'll be a little bit easier in themselves, and you'll
That's right.
both come to a more amicable a decision that's better for both of you.
Well, sure. Just think of again, words are very helpful. When people lock horns,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
If you, if your neck and your head are more flexible and easeful, you're much less likely in discussions with your significant other to lock horns. You'll be flexible. You'll be able to get out of those occasionally fricative contests that go on in any relationship, because your neck and your head will be freed up, so you won't be as stuck when you confront each other, right? You won't have your horns locked, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
or be stiff-necked about things. I mean, words are great because they really connote what it is that we're talking about.
Well, and if you in the Old Testament, the term stiff-necked appears a number of places,
That's right.
and generally is seen by most translators as being another term for stubborn or
Right. Obstinate.
obstinate. But it is interesting that when for example the
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh's, well, his heart was hardened. That's what happened
That's
to
right. I
him.
always felt he got a bum deal. It
He
wasn't
did,
his fault. He had his heart hardened.
but
But you know what he needed? He was being stiff-necked and not allowing the Jews to go back to Israel. All he needed was an
exactly.
Alexander lesson, and they wouldn't have had to have the plagues.
Absolutely, that's what we needed
The
back
next
in.
person you talk to should be a rabbi. Could the Alexander technique have helped in Pharaoh's time? Which is a conversation for another day.
Absolutely. But it is interesting that our language, perhaps, maybe we could say at sort of a subliminal level, reflects some pretty deep truths about how our physical state impacts or is related to
That's
or
true.
is another version of our mental state.
I agree. I think
And
that's
I think, for example, in the Old Testament, when the phrase "stiff-necked people" is used, and it's used a number of times, you have to ask why stiff-necked. I mean, God could have said stiff ankled, or and he didn't.
stiff-backed people.
Yeah, but he said stiff-necked, and of course, Alexander teachers who hear that think, well, of course, because the head neck upper torso relationship in our body is considered extremely important by most Alexander teachers, and we go through great lengths to help our students avoid stiffening that area.
That's right.
So, Ashley, is there anything you want to add before
No,
we?
I think we've
I
gotten
think we
about as
covered
far
it.
afield as we could, but I enjoyed this conversation a great deal.
I did as well. I never imagined we'd get to ancient Egypt, but why not?
Why not?
So, my guest today has been Ashley Adams, who is a union organizer and negotiator representing broadcasters and healthcare workers, and more recently, for the past 11 years, the Massachusetts Teachers Association. If you have any questions for Ashley, we're going to put a link to his website by the interview, and we're also going to put a link to his wife's website. His wife's name is Debbie Adams, and she is an Alexander teacher in the Boston area. And if anything that we've talked about interests you and you're not anywhere near Boston, but you'd like to explore the Alexander technique, find a teacher and have a lesson or two, and you might be amazed at what you'll discover about yourself, not just for negotiating purposes, but just in general. Ashley, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Robert.